Close your eyes for a moment. Think about the last time you walked into a room, shut the door behind you, and felt safe. Not because of anything dramatic, just the quiet weight of walls around you. The muffled sound of the world outside. The stillness. We have all felt it. That small, wordless relief of being inside. We build our entire lives around this feeling. We save for it, decorate it, dream about it. A place with walls. A place that says, "This is mine, and I am protected here." But here's a question that doesn't get asked enough. Why? Why do we, out of all the creatures on this earth, feel such a deep need to surround ourselves with walls? To understand why we build walls, we have to go back, very far back, to a time when the wall was not something humans made. It was something they found. Imagine a small group of early humans, perhaps 30 or 40,000 years ago, moving across an open landscape. No village, no shelter, just open sky, wind, and the constant awareness of danger. Predators moved in the dark. Rain came without warning. The cold did not care about you. And then, a cave. A crack in the rock face, just deep enough to crawl inside. In that moment, something changed. The rock walls did not belong to those people. They had not built anything, but for the first time, there was an inside and an outside. And inside felt different, quieter, controllable, survivable. This is where the story of walls begins. Not with architecture, not with design, with relief. Archaeologists have found evidence of humans living in caves across Europe, Asia, and Africa dating back hundreds of thousands of years. Some of those caves show signs of repeated use. Fire pits, tools, markings on the walls. People returned to the same sheltered spaces again and again, not because they were forced to, because something about enclosed space felt right. But humans are restless creatures. They could not always find caves. And so, slowly, they began to do something remarkable. They began to make the walls themselves. The earliest constructed shelters were simple. Branches bent into a curve, animal skins stretched over a frame, stones stacked loosely to block the wind. These were not houses in any way we would recognize today, but they carried the same intention as the cave. Create a boundary between me and everything else. Here's what's interesting about that intention. The earliest walls were not built to keep people in. They were built to keep the world out. Cold, out. Rain, out. Danger, out. The wall, at its very origin, was an act of refusal. A quiet, desperate no, drawn in stone and wood and earth. And this tells us something important about human nature. We are not simply social animals looking to gather together. We are also animals with a profound need for a space that belongs to us. A space where we can lower our guard. Where we do not have to be ready for anything. Where the alertness in our body can, just for a moment, rest. Think about a child building a den out of blankets and cushions. No one teaches them to do this. They do it naturally, instinctively, crawling inside, pulling the edges closed and sitting there in the dim, small space with a look of deep satisfaction. That child is not playing, or rather, they are playing at something ancient. They are practicing the oldest human act there is. The wall, it turns out, is not a modern invention. It is not a symbol of civilization or wealth or ambition. It is something far simpler and far older. It is the shape of a need. For a long time, the wall was purely practical. It kept the cold out. It kept the danger out. It asked nothing more of itself than that. But humans are meaning-making creatures. We cannot leave something alone for very long before we begin to layer it with ideas. And so, gradually, the wall began to carry more weight than stone or wood alone could explain. The shift happened as humans stopped moving and started staying. Around 10,000 years ago, in the river valleys of the Middle East, something extraordinary began to take shape. People who had spent generations following animals and seasons across the land made a different choice. They planted seeds. They waited. And because you cannot follow a harvest, they stayed near it. This single change, from moving to staying, transformed the wall completely. When you are always moving, a shelter is temporary. You build it, use it, leave it. It belongs to no one in particular, but when you stay, the shelter becomes something else. It becomes yours. And when something is yours, the wall that surrounds it is no longer just protection from the weather. It is a statement. One of the earliest known human settlements, Çatalhöyük, in modern-day Turkey, dates back nearly 9,000 years. What archaeologists found there was striking. Houses built tightly together, sharing walls with no streets or doors at ground level. People entered through holes in the roofs. Each interior space was carefully maintained. The dead were buried beneath the floors. The walls were painted. People were not just living inside these walls. They were investing in them, emotionally. Symbolically, this is the moment the wall became more than shelter. It became the boundary of a family, the edge of an identity. To be inside a particular set of walls was to belong to something, a household, a lineage, a name, and to be outside was to be, in some quiet but powerful way, other. Ownership followed naturally. If these walls are mine, then what is inside them is also mine. The concept of private property, one of the most powerful and complicated ideas in human history, did not begin in a courtroom or a legal document. It began with a wall. And with ownership came something else, comparison, a larger wall, a stronger wall, a wall made of better materials. In the ancient city of Ur, in what is now Iraq, archaeologists discovered residential areas where house sizes varied dramatically, some families living in grand multi-room compounds, others in single cramped spaces nearby. The wall had become a mirror. It showed the world not just where you lived, but who you were. A farmer returning from the fields, walking past the high mud brick walls of a wealthy neighbor's home, would have felt something, not just tiredness, something sharper, something that asked a quiet question about his own walls in return. The wall had begun its second life. It was no longer only about survival. It was about place, belonging, and quietly, inevitably, status. There is something no one tells you when you build a wall. The same wall that keeps the world out also keeps you in. This seems obvious when you say it out loud, but we rarely say it out loud. We spend so much energy thinking about what the wall protects us from that we almost never ask what it quietly costs us. And the cost, my friends, is real. And it has been with us for a very long time. Think about what happened as walls multiplied. As villages grew into towns, and towns into cities, and every family settled behind their own boundary, people were, in one sense, safer than they had ever been. Sheltered, established, protected, and yet something else was happening at the same time. The distance between people was growing, not the physical distance. Neighbors could live inches apart, sharing a wall made of nothing thicker than mud brick. The distance was something harder to measure, the distance of separateness, of lives being lived in parallel, behind closed doors, without visibility into one another. There is a word for what this distance eventually produces. We call it loneliness, but loneliness is a modern word for something ancient, the feeling of being enclosed while also being unreachable. Consider the experience of someone who has just moved into a new home, the excitement of it, the fresh walls, the arranged furniture, the sense of arrival, and then perhaps a few weeks later, a quieter feeling. The street outside carries voices, movement, the sounds of other lives, but inside there is only silence. The walls that felt like protection now feel, on certain evenings, like something else entirely, like a container, like a kind of invisible solitude that was never quite chosen. We have all touched this feeling. Most of us do not speak about it very much, and here's where the hidden cost deepens. Because the wall does not only separate us from neighbors or strangers, over time it begins to shape how we see other people's walls. A house with high fences becomes a source of suspicion. A family that keeps themselves becomes, in the imagination of the street, unknowable. The very boundaries we build for safety begin to generate unease in others, and eventually in ourselves. The wall promises security, and it delivers it, but security and connection are not the same thing. In fact, they can quietly work against each other. The more completely we seal ourselves in, the more the world outside begins to feel unfamiliar. And the more unfamiliar it feels, the higher we are tempted to build. It becomes a cycle with no clear beginning. Protection leads to distance. Distance leads to unease. Unease leads to more protection. No one designed this. No one chose it consciously. It is simply what happens when the wall, built first out of pure necessity, begins to carry more meaning than any single structure was ever meant to hold. The wall was supposed to be an answer. Somewhere along the way, it also became a question. At some point in human history, the wall stopped being something you built and became something you bought. This change did not happen all at once. It crept in slowly, the way most large changes do, through economics, through industry, through the quiet accumulation of decisions made by people who were simply trying to solve a problem. The problem, in the 19th century, was scale. Cities were filling faster than they could be built. The Industrial Revolution pulled millions of people off the land and into urban centers. London, Chicago, Shanghai, Paris, in search of work. They needed somewhere to live. And what emerged to meet that need was something entirely new: the housing market. For the first time in human history, walls were being mass-produced. Rows of identical brick houses appeared across working-class neighborhoods. Apartment blocks rose to house as many people as possible in as little space as possible. By the early 20th century, in cities across the industrialized world, the home had become a commodity, something with a price, something you could own, or, more often, rent from someone who did. This was a profound shift, because when the wall becomes a product, something changes in how we relate to it. A shelter built by your own hands from materials you gathered carries a different meaning than a unit in a development purchased through a bank. One is an expression of need meeting effort. The other is a transaction. And transactions, however practical, carry a certain emotional distance inside them. And yet, the hunger did not disappear. People still wanted the wall to mean something. They still wanted it to feel like theirs. And so, into the space between the transaction and the feeling, an entire industry grew. Interior design, home decor, property television, the language of curb appeal and investment potential and forever homes. Today, in many countries, the home is not only the largest financial decision most people will ever make. It is also one of the most emotionally loaded. Studies consistently show that homeownership is tied, in people's minds, not just to security, but to identity, self-worth, and social standing. We are, in other words, still doing what the residents of ancient Ur were doing, using our walls to tell the world and ourselves who we are. The materials have changed, the scale has changed, but the instinct is the same. Consider the quiet ritual of a family hanging pictures on the walls of a new house. It is, practically speaking, unnecessary. The house functions perfectly well without them, but something about an empty wall feels unfinished, not architecturally but personally. The pictures are not decoration so much as they are a declaration. We live here. These walls are ours. This is who we are. The modern housing system took something ancient and primal and turned it into an economy, and we stepped into that economy willingly because it offered us the one thing the wall has always promised: a place in the world, a boundary between ourselves and everything uncertain beyond it. So here we are. After all of this, the caves, the settlements, the cities, the markets, the mortgage agreements, and the picture hooks and the carefully chosen paint colors, we arrive at a question that has no clean answer. What are we really building? When we build a wall, on the surface, the answer seems simple: protection, privacy, a place to rest. And all of that is true. The wall does those things. It has always done those things. That is why we keep returning to it, generation after generation, in every culture on every continent. The need is real. It would be wrong to pretend otherwise. But underneath the practical answer, there is something quieter, something worth sitting with. When we build a wall, we're also making a claim, not just about property or space, but about ourselves. We are saying, I am a person who has a place. I am someone who belongs somewhere. I exist, and here's the shape of my existence. The wall, in this sense, is less about the world outside and more about the self inside. It is a way of making yourself real, of drawing a line that says, here's where I begin, and there's where everything else continues without me. And perhaps this is why the feeling of home is so powerful and so difficult to describe. It is not really about the building. It is about the feeling of being held, contained, defined. The walls of a home do not only keep the wind out, they keep the shapelessness out, the formlessness of a world that is vast and indifferent and does not know your name. But here's the thought I want to leave with you, my friends. If we look honestly at the walls we build, the physical ones, yes, but also the invisible ones, the habits of distance, the routines of privacy, the quiet decisions to stay inside rather than step out, we might notice something, that some of those walls were built for very good reasons, at a very particular moment, and that moment has passed, but the wall is still standing. We are all, to some degree, living inside walls we did not consciously choose, walls inherited from fear, from habit, from a world that no longer exists in quite the same shape it did when we first needed protecting. The question is not whether walls are good or bad. They are neither. They're human. They are as human as anything we have ever made. The question is simply this: which walls are still serving you? And which ones have quietly become a kind of prison you forgot to question? A home should be a place you choose to be, not only a place you are afraid to leave. And the most important walls, in the end, may not be the ones made of brick or wood or glass. They may be the ones we carry inside ourselves, long after the doors have been left open. Thank you for listening, my friends. I hope this gave you something to think about, not just about houses, but about the quiet architecture of your own inner life. Until next time, my friends, sleep well and stay curious.